Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. Today I am in St James's. Hopefully you can see St James's Palace behind me there. Sorry about the traffic noise, impossible to find a spot here where we're not getting cars in the background. Going to be touring the pubs of St James's today. There are just 6 by my count. Of course, there is some amount of subjectivity in what actually counts as a pub, but if you look back to the 1890s, there were at least 21 marked on the Ordnance Survey maps of the day, so things have gone into a bit of state of decline, but hopefully among that handful that remain we can find some gems for our first pub. We're heading just a stone's throw away from St James's Palace. It is opposite where I stand now, beneath Quebec House into Crown Passage. Alas, there's some building work taking place in Crown Passage at the moment, so we're not exactly seeing it in its best light, but it is, we are assured, open as usual, the Red Lion. The current building dates to the 1860s, but there possibly was a pub on this site and possibly of this name dating back to the original development of St James's as an area around the 1670s. Possibly has the second oldest license in the West End. Cheers from the beautiful Red Lion. Crown Passage. I think I've probably started with the best and it will only go downhill from here, but this is without a doubt my favourite pub in St James's and probably most of central London. It has a wonderful sort of village pub kind of feel to it, and it's a great reprieve, is that the word I'm looking for, from city life. While here, we should probably deal with the elephant in the room about the name Red Lion. There are at least 2 main competing theories about the source of this. As you may be aware, it's a very common pub name in the UK. There are in the region of 500, 600 pubs in England and Wales named the Red Lion. The 2 main theories about the origin of it, one is that it relates to John of Gaunt, and then the second is that it comes from James I. But both of those are slightly controversial and not hugely backed by evidence. The Red Lion is of course a heraldic charge, I think is the word, an emblem or device used in heraldry in the coats of arms of kings and queens and members of the aristocracy. And it appears in the coats of arms of something like 150 families. So you really have to look at the kind of local context to understand how and why the Red Lion is being used. I don't think there's really a one-size-fits-all answer to why any given pub is called the Red Lion. Here, of course, the development of St James's was very inextricably linked with Charles II. It was during Charles II's reign that most of the buildings that we see today that remain in St James's were developed. He's of course part of the House of Stuart and grandson of James I, so it may well relate to James I and that period of history where we had these joint English-Scottish kings, and you can see the Red Lion as an emblem in both James I's coat of arms and Charles I and Charles II. There is of course, as with many old pubs, there is a rumour about a tunnel linking this to nearby St James's Palace and possibly used as a means of secret liaison between Charles II and Nell Gwyn. I don't think there's really any truth in it, alas. There is a temptation after the Red Lion in Crown Passage, well actually to not leave in the first place and also think we'll just sod the rest. Of course it's not going to get any better than that, but sorry. But that wouldn't make for much of a video, would it? So let's press on up Crown Passage, which again we're not really seeing in its best light given all this construction work. It's quite unfortunate. The north end of Crown Passage brings us out onto King Street, and possibly its most famous resident being Christie's, the auction house across the road there. So next up, the Golden Lion. Quite a tall, slender, infill almost of a pub, although it predates its neighbours. Current building dates to the 1890s, but there has apparently been a pub on this site since at least the 1730s, and at least one architectural commentator refers to it rather unkindly, I think, as a grotesque imitation of the Jacobean Baroque. I think it's a rather handsome edifice myself, with the bay window at the front there, and then a slightly more subtle two-floor oriel window on the second, third floors up there. Has a sort of slightly theatrical air to it, which is fitting because this was once a neighbour of the St James's Theatre. We'll get onto that in a moment. Okay, see what it's like inside. You can see there, but at one time this was connected to the neighbouring St James's Theatre, which was next door between 1835, just reading off the side of there, and 1957. There's a gallery here in the stairwell, some figures of note who were associated with the St James's Theatre, including Oscar Wilde here. That was the location of the first performance of The Importance of Being Earnest. So the first time "in a handbag" was ever uttered on stage to a public audience, at least, was here, or next door to here, in the St James's Theatre. It's a Green King pub today. I don't think it can quite hold up in terms of character and individuality to the Red Lion or the Chequers around the corner, but you know, it's architecturally quite interesting. It has that interesting bit of history connected to the St James's Theatre. They have an eponymous ale, the Golden Lion Golden Ale, which is a thing that Green King often do in their pubs, which is usually just one of their standard beers rebadged. Couldn't quite figure out which one it was, but it was £3.05 for a half, so I think that would come in at £6.10 for a pint. Henry Jermyn, first Earl of St Albans, a very pivotal figure in the development of St James's. He was granted a leasehold of the land that is now St James's Square. You can take a look through the gardens, in fact. In 1662, and then eventually managed to negotiate that into a freehold of this land. You have to remember that sort of period of history somewhat coincided with rather a bad period for London. We had the interregnum just before, we had a Great Fire of London later in the 1660s, and of course plague, and Samuel Pepys was there to document all of that. And there was a bit of a movement of the gentry, of the nobility in London, away from the City of London during that time, out towards the West End. There is a plaque here to Henry Jermyn, one of those snuffers for gas lamps. It's like an old gas lamp fitting. So this was the site of Henry Jermyn's London residence and the place where he died in 1684. He was an interesting character, a very good friend of Henrietta Maria of France, who was Charles I's wife and Charles II's mother. There are completely unsubstantiated rumours that Henry Jermyn had an affair with Henrietta Maria of France, and possibly even fathered Charles II. No real evidence to support that. But by all accounts, a dashingly handsome chap in his day, and seemed to be very popular in court. And it could well be the fact that his ability to negotiate with the king at the time of, with Charles II, the king at the time that St James's was developed, had something to do with his special relationship with his mother. Who knows? Next up, the Chequers Tavern. It's a fairly common pub name, the Chequers, and there is a theory that it may even date back to the Roman occupation of Britain, in that there is evidence at Pompeii of the checkerboard being used as a sign for taverns. However, in the case of this particular pub, it may have a different derivation altogether. There was a house called Cavendish House that used to be next door, and the then Mason's Arms was a popular spot for the coachmen who were delivering guests to and fro the Cavendish house to be entertained by their illustrious owners. And they would sit here, the coachmen, while they were waiting for their guests to have supper or whatever it was they were doing, and play checkers, which is quite possibly the derivation of this particular pub name. This is another pub with alleyway drinking potential. Very handy shelf there, running this little alleyway that links us with Mason's Yard, which we'll take a look at in a moment. Bit of an angle, but cheers from the outside the Chequers. £2.85 for half of London Pride. I think the operator is a small company called Shannon Pubs. I haven't seen a lot of pubs owned by them, at least in London, so I think you could just about call this an independent pub as well. Certainly not owned by one of the major companies that seem to own vast swathes of London pubs. And a good bit of individual character inside. Only had a very brief glimpse, but from here there is a wonderful shortcut through Mason's Yard to the next pub, the Red Lion on Duke of York, the other Red Lion on Duke of York Street. So at the corner of Mason's Yard is this sort of blink and you'd miss it little alleyway that connects through to Ormond Yard. This little connecting passageway is complete with this curious hobbit-sized door, and then it leads out onto Ormond Yard here. I find Ormond Yard rather bittersweet today because it's bereft of any functioning businesses anymore. It just has the backs of a few shops of Jermyn Street. But once upon a time, this tiny little unit here was in fact my barber up until as recently as less than 10 years ago. This is Briggs, or was Briggs, and was the location of Philip, who was the owner and sole barber at Briggs, who was still cutting hair well into his 90s, bless him. So that brings us on to Duke of York Street and what is probably St James's most famous and most visited pub, the other Red Lion, the Red Lion on Duke of York Street. As with many of the other pubs we've seen today in St James's, the current building dates to the 19th century, to 1821, and was remodelled quite extensively in 1871. But there may well have been a pub on this site for some time before that. It's the highlight here at the Red Lion on Duke of York Street are these beautiful etched mirrors. I believe it is a technique called French embossing, which involves the use of acid to dissolve away part of the glass and create these kind of textures and contours, and it then reflects the light in a particularly appealing way. We think the etching may possibly be the work of Walter Gibbs and Sons, and was considered some of the most advanced techniques of the day. This style of pub is sometimes possibly erroneously referred to as a gin palace. I'm not sure at any point in this pub's history it would have ever focused very strongly on gin. It would always have been probably a beer-led pub, but it has been, typically used for pubs that had these kind of opulent interiors, which were designed to sort of invite a better standard of customer in the late Victorian era. There are 3 doors at the front of the pub, and at one time the tiny interior, it's something like 30 square metres of the Red Lion, would have been divided into something like 5 separate bar areas, but all of them served by this single central island servery. Today it's a fuller's pub, and I have to say they do a very good job of keeping this place in good nick, beautifully preserved. Do a very good job of maintaining the interior here. Behind me is the blue posts, so we can get a bit more of the building in shot. As you can see, very modern building. I knew this in an earlier incarnation from the 1950s. The building prior to that had been destroyed in World War II, but then it was rebuilt again in around 2015. So a very modern sort of office block type building above it now, and a modern reincarnation of this pub as a Green King pub. Apparently there has been a pub on this site dating back to the 1680s. As always, take that with a pinch of salt. As I say, the Green King pub will have covered at least one of those already on today's pub tour, so I think I'll skip this one. So beyond Duke of York Street, we enter onto Jermyn Street, a street named after Henry Jermyn. One of the little side streets off Jermyn Street is Babmay's Street, which derives from Baptist May, who was another courtier and friend of Charles II during the era that St James's was being established. And this has the 3 Crowns on it. There has been a pub on this site called the 3 Crowns dating back to at least the 1820s. At that time, this section of what is now Babmay's Street was called Wells Street, and the current building dates to the 1930s, and the what is now a sort of office block around the pub was constructed. Not a particularly venerable pub in its current guise. Oddly, I've never been in here before, so I'm kind of intrigued to try and see what it's like. It's another Green King pub, so the beer offering is going to be similar to the Golden Lion back there, but just for the sake of completeness. So yes, the interior there was at best 1930s, and much of it much more modern than that. But there was at least a tiny bit of effort made there in terms of pub interiors. I quite like the it's called the gantry above the bar, this sort of glazed area for glass storage, a suspended shelf above the bar. But they had a slightly more interesting beer selection actually than the Golden Lion round the corner, also Green King pub, and there was at least Landlord on tap. I am back where I started, outside St James's Palace. I hope you found some of that tour of St James's pubs interesting. I would say if you're only going to one pub in St James's, just go to the Red Lion in Crown Passage. If you're going to 2, go to the other Red Lion. And if you're going to 3 or 4, then I think the Chequers on Duke Street has quite a lot of character. And I think the Golden Lion, despite being a Green King sort of chain pub, probably deserves an honourable mention for the architecture and the history. Anyway, babbling now. Thank you very much for watching. I hope some of that was useful and or enjoyable and or informative, and I'll see you on the next one.